The Imperium has never known true silence, not even in its darkest millennia. Beneath the endless thunder of war and the ceaseless chanting of a billion faithful, there is a quieter sound, too soft for mortal ears, too ancient for any vox recorder to define. It is the pulse beneath reality, a rhythm older than Terra itself. Some say it is the Astronomican. Others whisper it is the echo of a god's dreaming breath. But there are those, hidden among the administratum archives and sealed vaults of the Adeptus Custodes, who claim it is something far more terrifying: the slow, almost imperceptible stirring of the Emperor upon the golden throne. If that rumor is true, if that faint pulse is not a machine, not a psychic flare, but a heartbeat, then the galaxy is not witnessing the end of an age. It is witnessing the moment before an awakening. And every civilization, every species, every creature that crawls beneath the indifferent stars, will feel the consequences of a god rising from a 10,000-year slumber. What happens when the Emperor finally opens his eyes? What becomes of the Imperium built on his silence? And what does the galaxy become when the most powerful psychic being in known existence remembers its name? This is not prophecy. This is not doctrine. This is the whispered fear carried by the most faithful, the most heretical, and the most terrified minds of the 41st millennium. If the Emperor wakes, nothing remains unchanged. If stories like this pull you deeper into the shadows of the Imperium, if you want more explorations of its mysteries, tragedies, and impossible futures, then stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe so the signal keeps reaching you through the static of the galaxy. Now breathe in, steady yourself, and follow the pulse beneath the throne. The corridors of the Imperial Palace were silent in the way only the truly immense can be. Silence here was not absence of sound, but a living weight that pressed against the mind and body, as if the walls themselves were breathing. Vaulted ceilings rose like the skeletons of dead titans, draped in banners older than any human memory, the golden threads dulled by centuries of incense smoke and whispered prayers. The custodes walked in perfect cadence, their gilded armor clinking with a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the palace itself. Among them, even the most seasoned warriors felt it first as an imperceptible quiver beneath the soles of their boots, a tremor that the brain wanted to explain but could not. Some thought it a structural shift, a minor quake born on Terra's ancient crust. Others whispered that the throne itself had sighed. The first to notice it with any clarity was a tech priest named Malric, a thin, wiry figure with copper eyes that gleamed beneath the ceramite of his headplate. He had been tending the golden conduits that fed the throne, running his augmetic fingers along the hum of promethium-fed machinery, when the sensation hit him. A pulse. Not mechanical, not electrical. Something beneath, something impossibly vast. His fingers twitched, the servitors paused in their mindless duties, and for a heartbeat, the hall seemed to hold its breath. The other tech priests looked up, eyes narrowing behind lenses that reflected the light of thousands of candles. None spoke. To speak was to admit fear, and fear had no place here. Yet the tremor did not vanish. It pulsed again, soft, uneven, like the stirrings of a giant trapped in slumber. Malric tried to focus on the mechanisms. The cogitators, the data slates, the arcane matrix of electrodes that kept the Emperor alive. Every readout showed nothing. Every gauge, every psychosensory indicator, whispered perfection. Yet still, the pulse lingered, resonating through the hall in frequencies that no machine could measure. He shook his head, willing his instincts to obey reason, but even as he moved toward the throne, his mind could not silence the question: is he waking? Rumors had always circulated among the custodians. Stories passed in whispers over centuries, tales of moments when the Emperor's body stirred, when the smallest twitch of muscle was mistaken for a living heartbeat. The administratum had catalogued them all as myth, heresy, the superstitions of those too close to awe. Yet these murmurs had a weight that grew heavier with time, a gravity of possibility that pressed against belief itself. Even the most disciplined warriors found their prayers growing longer, more desperate, as if words could anchor reality and hold the pulse at bay. The tremor moved like a tide, gentle at first, almost comforting, then with an inexorable insistence that made every step in the gilded hall feel unsteady. Servitors paused mid-task, their grinding limbs creaking in protest as if they too perceived the shift. Malric's copper eyes scanned the endless columns, the mosaic floors depicting eons of victories, saints, and martyrs, yet every image seemed suddenly fragile, as though the very foundations of history trembled in rhythm with the unseen heartbeat. The air itself seemed to quiver, carrying a taste of ozone and something faintly metallic, a reminder that promethium alone could not account for the scent. The custodes did not react immediately. They were trained to endure impossibilities, to exist on the edge of faith and terror without faltering. Yet subtle signs betrayed their composure. Helms tilted, as if listening. Fingers flexed over ornate weapons, not in readiness, but instinctively. A sense of anticipation grew. And it was here, in the hushed distance between movement and sound, that the first truly unexplainable thing occurred. One of the throne's golden spires shivered, a minute flicker of light running along its surface, and the pulse, soft, insistent, echoed in Malric's chest as though it had been waiting there all his life. He dropped to one knee, and the world seemed to tighten around him. This was no quake. This was not machinery. This was something alive. Something that had been watching, waiting, for the patience of millennia to bear fruit. For the first time in the histories of the Adeptus Custodes, the impossible felt imminent. It was not fear that gripped him, nor awe, but a mixture of both, laced with a sharp, intoxicating sense of destiny. If the Emperor were waking, the galaxy itself would shift under the weight of that awareness. Every planet, every starship, every mind tethered to the Astronomican would reel. The pulse, quiet as it was, carried the gravity of an event so profound that no psionic reading could predict it, no tactical doctrine could prepare for it. Malric rose, moving closer to the throne, and for a moment the hall felt like a universe compressed. The golden pillars and the marble floors became a microcosm, a reflection of all that humanity had built under a silent God. And then he noticed a subtle vibration along the throne's backrest, so slight that it might have been imagined. Yet the whispered voice in his mind, one that he dared not name aloud, spoke plainly. He stirs. He reached a trembling hand toward the throne. Malric's hand hovered over the gilded surface, and the sensation of the pulse grew sharper, more defined, as though it had been waiting for contact. The Emperor's throne was more than a machine. It was a cathedral of psychic energy, a lattice of sacred mechanisms designed to hold back time and death, to channel a god's presence into the fragile minds of humanity. And now, after 10 millennia, it seemed almost to breathe, almost to respond to the touch of one frail priest. His augmetic fingers traced the golden curves, feeling the subtle warmth that should not exist, a life bleeding through circuits and cogitators. Every nerve ending sang with tension, the echoes of a universe on the brink of revelation. The custodes noticed too, but their reactions were restrained, as always, measured. Even so, the twitch of a gauntlet hand, the brief tilt of a helm toward the throne betrayed recognition. They did not speak. Speech would be unnecessary. This was something that transcended commands, transcended ritual. The pulse was a language older than Terra itself, one understood not with ears or eyes, but with the deepest folds of the soul. In that moment, every chant of the Adeptus Ministorum, every liturgy, every whispered prayer for guidance, became a thin membrane separating reality from a possibility that no doctrine dared name. Beyond the palace walls, in the chambers of the Administratum, data slates quivered as if an unseen hand had tapped them. The scribes did not notice the tremor at first. They were too busy compiling reports of attrition, resource deficits, and imperial taxation schedules. But when the pulse rippled across their sensors, even their mechanical instruments paused. Screens flickered, the cogitator relays hummed at a slightly different frequency, and a subtle anxiety spread through the ranks. Some astropaths raised their hands instinctively to their foreheads, moaning soft prayers, while others fell silent, staring at nothing, gripped by an awareness they could neither explain nor suppress. Malric withdrew his hand slowly, heart hammering as if it sought to keep pace with the rhythm beneath his palm. There was no doubt in his mind now. The tremor was not machinery, not a glitch in the cogitators, not a flicker of warp energy. This was something alive, deliberate, and incomprehensibly vast. Even the Emperor's silence had been a force, but what stirred now was beyond even that. And with that awareness came an unavoidable truth. If the Emperor's slumber was ending, the galaxy would not simply awaken with him. It would convulse, twist, and shiver in response to the smallest motion of a god's intent. Outside, the palace walls seemed to hum, responding to a frequency unseen, unheard, but profoundly felt. Servitors shuffled nervously, their pre-programmed routines disrupted by a pulse that exceeded their mechanical comprehension. Even the monumental banners, stitched with victories and prayers from 10,000 worlds, seemed to quiver, as if the threads themselves remembered a presence long dormant. And within the marble floors, the ancient mosaic patterns appeared to ripple subtly, reflecting the rhythm of a pulse no mortal eye could perceive. Malric knelt again, pressing his forehead to the polished surface, letting the vibrations sink into him. He felt a memory of the galaxy itself, the wars, the triumphs, the uncountable deaths and victories, and beneath it all, a truth too vast to articulate. The Imperium, all of it, had been built on a single constant, a silent god. That constant was ending. And as the pulse deepened, as it sank into every corner of his consciousness, Malric understood that nothing in the history of humanity, or even the stars themselves, could prepare him for what was coming. A soft whisper echoed in his mind, one not his own, one he could neither identify nor ignore. It was not language, exactly, but intent, a force pressing against his very understanding. "I am waking." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of eternity. And in that moment, Malric knew that the first tremor had passed only to reveal the storm beneath it, a storm that would sweep across Terra, across the stars, across the fragile construct of an empire built on silence and faith. The pulse did not stop. It grew, subtle but insistent, as though calling to the galaxy, demanding attention, claiming dominion before even fully revealing its form. And in the depths of the palace, among the custodes and the tech priests, there was no joy, no fear, only the terrible awe of proximity to a god returning to consciousness. Every thought, every prayer, every ritual became insignificant in the face of the first undeniable stirrings. The Imperium was about to remember the god it had worshipped in silence for 10,000 years. And the galaxy, like the golden halls of the palace itself, would never be the same. The pulse deepened, settling into a rhythm that seemed to echo across every surface, every fiber of consciousness within the palace. Malric's copper eyes widened, reflecting the vastness of the throne room as if he could see every corner at once, every gilded column, every shadowed recess. It was not light that drew his gaze but gravity. The way the atmosphere itself seemed denser, almost liquid, as though reality had thickened in response to a presence stirring from millennia of slumber. The golden throne, a lattice of sacred machinery and psychic resonance, no longer appeared inert. It breathed subtly, impossibly, and each exhalation sent vibrations through the hall that resonated deep in the chest, shaking the bones in ways no amount of armor could shield against. The custodes moved with a precision born of centuries, yet Malric noticed the almost imperceptible hesitation in their steps. Their eyes, hidden behind gem-like lenses, betrayed a recognition of something that could not be catalogued, could not be disciplined. Even the disciplined chant of the cathedral priests faltered briefly, the rhythmic intonations scattering like leaves before a storm. A servant of the Mechanicum froze mid-step, arm outstretched over a control panel, fingers twitching as if guided by some invisible hand. Somewhere in the recesses of his mind, Malric understood. The Emperor's presence was not merely returning. It was communicating, asserting a subtle dominion before the galaxy could even perceive him fully. And then the whispering began. Not the prayers of men, not the liturgies of the faithful, but something else entirely. A sound like wind in deep metal, like distant gears turning in a machine too vast for comprehension, pressed into his skull. He recoiled, fighting instinct, praying silently, but the pulse, persistent and absolute, wrapped around every thought, bending it, weaving it into patterns that he could not decipher. It was neither benevolent nor malevolent. It simply was. To resist it was to resist existence itself. He dared to glance around the hall. The custodes had drawn closer to the throne, their spears lowered, not in attack but in a form of reverence older than any ritual. The banners overhead seemed to shiver in sympathy with the pulse, threads gleaming as if kissed by some distant flame. The marble floors reflected not light but a subtle distortion, as though reality itself bent in tiny waves around the throne. Each step Malric took toward it felt simultaneously necessary and forbidden, as if the hall itself both urged him onward and warned of the consequences. Every instrument, every gauge, every cogitator feed was silent, utterly normal, yet Malric knew the truth with a certainty that defied evidence. The Emperor was waking. Not fully, not gloriously, but perceptibly. Each quiver of the throne, each subtle vibration across the halls, was a harbinger of events the galaxy was wholly unprepared to face. And yet, even in the awe that gripped him, Malric understood another truth. Nothing would wait for preparation. Reality would bend first, question later. For a long, suspended moment, he simply stood there, head bowed before the impossibly vast presence he could not see yet could not ignore. The pulse was not random. It was deliberate. Deliberate in the same way a god might choose which star to move first, which life to touch, which truth to reveal. And then, softer than thought, he heard it again in his mind. I am waking. It was not a promise. It was not a warning. It was a statement of fact, absolute and indifferent to human comprehension. The pulse surged once more, wrapping the hall in its subtle gravity, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the palace was no longer a palace, the custodes were no longer merely guards, and Malric was no longer merely a servant of machinery. They were witnesses. Witnesses to the stirrings of a being that had slept while humanity built an empire in his name, a being whose very consciousness could reshape stars. Malric fell to one knee again, overwhelmed by the scope of it. The tremor had begun as a whisper, a subtle warning, a gentle prod against reality. Now it was a certainty, a truth that required no interpretation, only recognition. He could not measure it, could not analyze it, could only feel the weight of inevitability pressing against his chest, filling his lungs with the odor of ozone, incense, and something older than the stars. The throne hummed beneath him, alive and incomprehensible, and he understood with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The first tremor was not an event. It was the beginning of the reckoning. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, across light years and star systems, worlds would stir. Astropaths would awaken screaming from visions they could not explain. Navigators would sense shifts in the warp that were not navigational but existential. And the Imperium itself, built on 10,000 years of silence and faith, would feel the ripple before it ever comprehended the tide. Malric bowed his head to the throne, whispering a prayer that was no longer for protection or guidance. It was a prayer of acknowledgement, a prayer for understanding that he knew would never come. The pulse persisted, insistent, unyielding, and the palace walls seemed to hum in recognition. The Emperor stirred. And the galaxy, though yet unaware, had begun to tremble. Far from Terra, in the endless black between star systems, the first signs of disruption reached the far-flung outposts of the Imperium like invisible fingers brushing the psyche of men and women unaccustomed to the impossible. On the bridge of the vigilant Retribution, a light cruiser of the Astra Militarum, astropaths sat with closed eyes, fingers pressed to their foreheads, muttering prayers that were half words and half images. They felt the pulse before it touched the material. It did not move like a wave of energy but like a suggestion, a subtle insistence in the warp that bent thought and dream alike. Some screamed, some wept silently, a few fell into trance-like stillness, seeing visions they could not interpret. The navigator, pale and trembling, stared into the void ahead, seeing the star lanes warp and flicker as though the map of the galaxy itself had shifted beneath an unseen hand. Across the void, planetary administrators reported systems vanishing from sensors only to reappear moments later, with readings so distorted they defied comprehension. Data slates registered impossible fluctuations in mass and energy, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Entire planets seemed to shimmer in and out of perception, though physical destruction was absent. The pulse that had begun beneath the throne now moved through the Astronomican, rippling along the psychic beacon that stretched like a thread of light across the warp. Astropaths on distant worlds felt it as a tugging in their minds, a pressure at the edge of comprehension. Rumors erupted among the faithful. Some spoke of miracles, others of divine wrath, and a few whispered in terror that the Emperor himself was stirring from the Golden Throne. In the manufactorum worlds of the segmentum solar, tech priests and servitors paused mid-task, sensing the subtle changes in the ambient psychic field. Prometheum lines vibrated unnaturally, circuits hummed a tone that had no origin, and cogitators produced numbers that should have been impossible. In the halls of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the whispers of Martian litanies grew more insistent, almost panicked, though the priests themselves would never admit such doubt aloud. They murmured of the Omnisia stirring, though they knew it was neither omnisia nor machine alone, but something older, something beyond comprehension. Even the most devout among them, schooled in centuries of certainty, felt the pull of awe mixed with fear, a fear not of death, but of understanding too vast for a human mind. Meanwhile, on distant fortress worlds, Imperial knights sensed unease in their throne mechanicum. The pulse did not reach them as sound or vibration but as a distortion in instinct, a subtle tug against certainty. Engines shivered, weapon calibrations fluctuated, and pilots felt the warp twist around their senses. Some considered it a premonition, others shrugged it off as fatigue or coincidence, but those trained to perceive the rhythms of war, the rhythm of causality itself, recognized that something monumental had begun. The Emperor, they understood in the deepest, most primal parts of themselves, was no longer silent, and the galaxy, vast and indifferent as it seemed, had begun to respond. Even the orc fleets, scattered across sectors as endless as they were chaotic, felt it in ways their crude minds could only interpret as anticipation. Whack! Leaders bellowed orders that no one obeyed, as if the universe itself had altered the frequency of instinct. Energy fields shimmered around Necron tomb worlds, subtle distortions that their eternal bodies detected as aberrations, though they could not comprehend the source. Even the most ancient and unfeeling of the galaxy's denizens sensed a change, a shift so fundamental that it echoed beyond language, beyond understanding, and into the core of existence itself. On the edge of the segmentum obscurus, a solitary imperial astropath collapsed into convulsions, babbling visions of light and shadow, stars burning out and reigniting, and voices that commanded attention in tones that could not exist outside the warp. He saw the Golden Throne alive, subtle vibrations rippling through it, and the pulse, now unmistakable, stretching outward, brushing entire systems as if the galaxy itself were a string and a finger had plucked it. And somewhere, deep in the void, the first notion of dread crept into the hearts of humanity. The Emperor's waking would not be clean. It would not arrive with grandeur or clarity. It would arrive as presence, as pressure, as a reminder that every plan, every law, every empire built in his absence was fragile. And that fragility would be felt everywhere. The ripple continued outward, slow at first, then with increasing intensity, touching every star system, every psychic channel, every mind tethered to the Astronomican. Sailors on distant void stations felt it as nausea, a vertigo that no gravity field could explain. Administrators on hive worlds noted spikes in population anxiety, civil unrest flaring in ways that made no political sense. Across sectors, nightmares plagued sleepers simultaneously, visions of a throne glowing with impossible energy, and a god's eyes opening to remember humanity. The galaxy was beginning to awaken, and the first stirrings from Terra had become a current strong enough to be felt in every corner of existence. The pulse did not distinguish between friend or foe, loyalist or heretic, machine or flesh. It spread like a contagion of inevitability, brushing the minds of those tethered to the warp with a subtle insistence. Change is coming. On the agri-world of Viridian Secundus, psychers screamed in the streets as visions of a throne glowing with impossible energy burned behind their eyes. Farmers dropped their tools, terrified of things they could not see, while city administrators recorded inexplicable fluctuations in power grids and communications relays. Even the planetary governor, shielded behind a wall of bureaucratic certainty, felt the pulse as a thrum of unnatural dread, a pressure at the back of his skull that whispered of events far beyond his comprehension. Aboard the Imperious Vigil, a battle barge in the Segmentum Tempestus, Chaplain Helios observed his space marines in formation, noting subtle, almost imperceptible hesitations. The Astartes were conditioned for war, trained to resist fear and doubt, yet the pulse pressed against their psyches like a weight too heavy for even the gene seed to ignore. Their bolters trembled slightly in their grips, the rhythmic chanting of the litanies of war faltering for the first time in centuries. Helios himself did not understand what he saw, but he felt it in the marrow of his bones. The Emperor's waking was not distant. It was a current stretching across the stars, touching every loyal heart and every shadowed mind alike. Even the novice Nobilite, far from Terra and responsible for guiding vessels through the labyrinthine paths of the warp, felt the disturbance as a tugging of fate itself. Navigators blinked and swayed, sensing eddies in the Imperium that no chart could explain. The patterns of the warp twisted subtly beneath their gaze, as if the fabric of reality had become elastic, bending to a force that was neither friendly nor malevolent but absolute. The pulse moved, not as sound, but as a premonition, and those attuned to the currents of the warp recognized it as both warning and inevitability. On a distant forge world in the Segmentum Obscurus, the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus observed strange fluctuations in servoskull activity, Prometheum feed lines, and data slates. Cogitators produced outputs that made no logical sense. Calculations of energy flux, stellar gravitation, and even temporal resonance all hinted at something altering the very structure of the Imperium's physical and psychic networks. Some whispered of miracles, others of heresy, but all felt a tremor in their understanding of reality itself. The Omnicia, they realized with trepidation, had not moved. This was not his doing. Something older, something impossibly vast, was reaching beyond Terra, and every system connected to the Astronomican shivered in response. Even the galaxy's most indifferent and alien denizens felt echoes of the change. On Necron tomb worlds, the Undying Lords detected subtle distortions in their energy matrices, fluctuations that suggested a presence beyond their comprehension. Orc warbands, scattered across uncounted systems, growled and shouted at nothing, suddenly aware of a force greater than WH40K. Impulses. The Tyrannid hive fleets, though slow to react to psychic disturbances, deviated slightly in trajectory, guided by instincts that had no name for the anomaly. Across the vastness of space, every conscious entity, every mechanism capable of perceiving the warp, felt the pull of the first tremor extending outward. Back on Terra, Malric and the Custodes remained unaware of the full scope of the ripple they had begun. Each quiver of the throne, each subtle vibration, sent messages into the farthest reaches of human space, brushing minds as subtly as a moth's wing. It was almost imperceptible to those who had not been trained to sense it, but for the attuned, the astropaths, the navigators, the psychers of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, it was unmistakable. Something monumental had begun, and it would not pause, wait, or allow the Imperium to prepare. The pulse that had started as a trembling whisper beneath the throne was now an invisible tide, spreading across the stars, touching all things, bending reality in ways no one could yet understand. And in that first wave, one truth crystallized: the Emperor's presence was no longer confined to Terra. The galaxy was feeling the stirrings of a god, and the ripple across the stars had begun. Worlds would wake to it differently. Some with awe, some with terror, some in disbelief, but no corner of the Imperium would remain untouched. Every consciousness, every mind, every perception tethered to the Astronomican would sense the shift. The stars themselves seemed to lean closer, listening, as if the universe understood the scale of what was happening long before the mortals inhabiting it could. The first tremor had become a current. A wave of inevitability was building, and far across the void, where the light of Terra barely touched, humanity began to feel, for the first time in 10,000 years, the weight of a god awakening. By the time the pulse reached the edge of known space, it had acquired a presence all its own, independent of the throne yet inseparable from it. Systems far beyond the segmentum solar experienced subtle distortions in time and perception, events that should have been impossible occurring in impossible simultaneity. An imperial colony in the Ultima Segmentum reported crops wilting and blooming within hours, entire climates shifting as if reality itself were uncertain. On another world, a psycher's mind fractured, projecting visions of a golden figure suspended upon a throne of light and metal, a presence vast enough to embrace countless worlds in a single gaze. The vision terrified him, yet it was not hatred or malice that he felt. It was inevitability. It was inevitability made manifest. On board the vigilant Retribution, Captain Valerius struggled to command his officers. Reports from astropaths, navigators, and distant scanners contradicted one another, and yet each told the same story. The pulse was moving, and it was changing everything it touched. Star charts fluctuated inexplicably, warp corridors shimmered and twisted, and entire fleets reported the sensation of being subtly shifted against their intended course, guided by a force they could neither see nor comprehend. The universe itself, it seemed, had begun to bend around the stirrings of a single being. Even the Imperium's enemies felt the change. Orc warlords growled at nothing, their instincts warning of a power beyond Warak. Rage. The Tyranid hive fleets hesitated at the edges of the galaxy, sensing a predator far more vast and intelligent than any they had ever encountered. Necron lords paused their endless machinations, energy fields trembling subtly in recognition of an intelligence whose scope they could not define. Across the galaxy, life, consciousness, and machine alike began to feel the pull of something larger, something ancient, something that was no longer sleeping. And yet, despite the universality of the ripple, humanity's perception was fractured. Some believed it a miracle. Some whispered of apocalypse. Administrators in the Imperium's most remote sectors scrambled to maintain order, but the pulse had no interest in order, only in perception. Minds capable of sensing it felt awe, fear, reverence, and terror all at once. Even those who could not perceive it directly experienced its effects. Inexplicable nightmares, sudden unease, a subtle pressure in the skull that left them unable to focus, as if the universe were breathing too close to them. It was everywhere, yet invisible, gentle in approach yet undeniable in presence. Back on Terra, Malric felt the pulse deepen within the Golden Throne. The Custodes had not yet seen the full implications of the stirrings, but he understood that every quiver, every subtle vibration beneath the throne's surface had begun to echo across the galaxy. Every world tethered to the Astronomican, every mind attuned to its psychic beacon, had felt the touch of a god beginning to move. And with that touch came awareness. This was not the start of an event confined to Terra alone. It was a ripple that could bend reality itself, and it would not stop. The astropaths far from the throne sensed it as a tugging in the warp, a pressure on the mind that demanded attention. Navigators perceived distortions in the Imperium that rendered even familiar routes uncertain. The Imperium's fleets, scattered across the void, experienced subtle shifts in trajectory, guided not by human command but by the invisible hand of something impossibly vast. Across the stars, every consciousness tethered to the Astronomican had begun to recognize the truth. The Emperor's waking was no longer a rumor, no longer speculation. It was a reality moving through the galaxy, subtle yet undeniable, like gravity bending the path of light. And in that realization lay both terror and awe. The first tremor had become a current, the first pulse, a wave. What began in the silent halls of the Imperial Palace had now become a force capable of reaching the edge of human perception. The Imperium, vast and sprawling, had been built on faith in the Emperor's silence. That silence was ending. Every mind, every star, every fleet would feel it, and none could prepare. The galaxy had begun to stir in response to the first tremor, and no one, loyalist, heretic, or alien, could know where it would end. For the Emperor was waking, and his pulse was already moving across the stars. The golden throne had begun to stir with a presence no machine could contain. Its gilded spires, polished by centuries of hands and prayers, glimmered with a light that was neither torch nor warp, but something else entirely. Malric knelt before it, aware that the pulse now carried intention, not merely the mechanical rhythm of sustaining life. There was motion beneath the surface, subtle yet undeniable, as if the Emperor, encased in his throne, were stretching against the confines of a world-built cage. The air itself seemed charged, thick with anticipation, carrying the faint metallic tang of ozone and the sharper bite of something alive. Even the custodes, unwavering for millennia, felt the pull of awe and dread tugging at the edges of their discipline. The whispers began, not through the lips of priests or scribes, but as thoughts pressed directly into the mind. Malric could feel them, a chorus of certainty and incomprehension speaking without words. "I am waking." The phrase was simple, absolute, and yet carried the weight of infinity. It rolled across his consciousness like a wave, erasing certainty and replacing it with the knowledge that reality was shifting, bending to the stirrings of a being humanity had revered for 10,000 years. And it was not triumph that filled him, nor fear alone, but an amalgam of both, inseparable and overwhelming, a gnawing recognition that the Imperium had been built on a foundation that no longer existed. The custodes flanked him, spears lowered but eyes alert, scanning every shadow and corridor. Their instincts, honed over centuries, did not waver, but even they could not fully deny the changes manifesting in the hall. Light seemed to bend subtly around the throne, shadows stretching in ways that defied geometry. The banners depicting victories across the millennia quivered as if they sensed the shift. Servitors paused mid-step, their cogitators processing inputs that did not exist. Every element of the palace, from the polished marble floors to the golden mosaic ceilings, resonated with the pulse, vibrating faintly in recognition of a force that had begun to assert itself. Malric pressed his hand once more to the throne, feeling the motion beneath the gilded surface. It was no longer a tremor. It was deliberate, a stretch of muscle-like energy within the psychic lattice that had held the Emperor in suspension. His copper eyes reflected not the marble nor the gold, but the faint shimmer of power, a presence vast enough to encompass the human mind yet incomprehensible in scope. He is waking, Malric thought, though thought felt inadequate, incapable of fully conveying the enormity of what he witnessed. Each heartbeat of the pulse seemed to carry centuries, millennia, and the weight of worlds, reminding him that time itself was subservient to the being on the throne. Outside the palace walls, the ripple of awakening accelerated. Astropaths, navigators, and psychers in distant systems experienced distortions so profound that some collapsed entirely under the strain. Entire fleets felt the subtle tug of an invisible hand in the warp, shifting courses with no command, guided by a presence that was neither malevolent nor merciful, but absolute. Administrators and governors reported sudden fluctuations in planetary conditions. Cities pulsated with an energy too subtle for sensors to detect, and crops grew and withered in moments, as if the galaxy itself had become a canvas for forces far beyond human understanding. Even alien civilizations, from the ordered Necron dynasties to the chaotic Orc hordes, sensed the stirrings, responding instinctively to a power that ignored faction and loyalty alike. Back within the throne room, the motion became more distinct. A subtle vibration, almost imperceptible at first, rippled through the backrest of the throne. It was the movement of a consciousness stretching, flexing, testing its boundaries after 10 millennia of suspension. Malric and the custodes did not flinch, but each felt the pressure, the awareness pressing at the edges of their minds. It was neither attack nor protection, merely assertion, a reminder that the Emperor was more than flesh, more than machine, more than legend. He was presence incarnate, and for the first time in 10,000 years, that presence had begun to awaken. The whispers intensified, not as speech but as certainty pressing into thought. I see. I remember. I move. Each phrase was not heard with ears, but with the soul, threading understanding and dread together so completely that no human mind could parse them apart. Malric's hand trembled, though he forced himself to remain still, knelt before the throne as if physical proximity could anchor him in reality. Around him, the custodes shifted slightly, recognizing instinctively that the Emperor's awakening was not a spectacle, not a miracle, not salvation. It was an event that would reshape existence itself. The pulse spread outward, beyond the palace, beyond Terra, across star systems and voids where human eyes had never gazed. Astropathic voices reached across light years, screaming in visions, in dreams, in prescient terror, as the galaxy felt the motion of a god who should not have moved. Light, matter, and thought bent subtly to the Emperor's awareness. And in that bending, every creature capable of perception understood, in fragmentary, horrifying clarity, that what had been impossible was becoming inevitable. The Emperor stirred. Not gloriously, not fully, but perceptibly. Reality had shifted to acknowledge him, and the ripple would not end. The galaxy, in all its infinite complexity, had begun to reckon with the opening of eyes that should never have been closed for so long. The throne pulsed again, stronger this time, and the air within the chamber seemed to thicken with presence. Malric's copper eyes tracked the tiniest flickers of movement along the golden surfaces, watching as ancient machinery, infused with sacred rites, reacted with a subtle intelligence that defied comprehension. The custodes flanking him were statuesque, yet even their disciplined muscles betrayed tension. Spear points reflected a light that was not from torch or sun, a shimmer that seemed to come from the throne itself. Every nerve in Malric's body felt drawn outward, toward the source, as if the Emperor's awareness had extended tendrils into the very marrow of the galaxy. Outside Terra, the ripples accelerated. A patrol fleet in the Segmentum Tempestus reported star lanes fluctuating inexplicably. Warp corridors twisted, and navigators began sweating, overwhelmed by the sudden, subtle tug of something vast. Astropaths screamed across comms, sending frantic, distorted messages as visions of a throne glowing with impossible energy burned in their minds. On hive worlds, populations stirred with unease, a collective subconscious whispering of change, though no one could articulate its cause. Administrators observed inexplicable anomalies in energy grids, communications, and civic functions. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus noted promethium conduits humming at frequencies they had never encountered, cogitators producing numbers that defied physics and mathematics alike. Across the Imperium's enemies, the effect was no less profound. Orc warlords growled at empty voids, their instincts warning of forces beyond the Waak. The Tyrannid hive fleets hesitated at the edges of surveyed space, instinctively aware of a predator incomprehensibly vast. Necron lords, ancient beyond human measure, paused their machinations, subtle energy distortions betraying recognition of something both alien and omnipotent. Across the void, across species and allegiance, the galaxy recoiled in recognition of the pulse emanating from the Golden Throne. Within the throne room, the Emperor's stirrings became more pronounced. A subtle expansion and contraction under the surface of the throne suggested muscular movement, something impossible, yet undeniable. Malric's mind strained to comprehend it. Each quiver carried the weight of centuries, millennia even, as though time itself were pliable under the awareness of the being beneath the gilded lattice. The custodes' disciplined breathing betrayed their vigilance. Each exhalation seemed synchronized with the pulse, though no mortal could have intended such alignment. It was instinct, training, and fear coalescing into silent acknowledgement. Then, the whispering changed. No longer was it just a phrase pressing into thought. Now, it carried nuance, curiosity, and an almost imperceptible questioning. What has been done? What remains? The words, or the presence, penetrated consciousness as if to probe understanding, testing the boundaries of perception, weaving awe and terror into an inseparable fabric. Malric felt the weight of them in his chest, the knowledge that the Emperor was aware not only of his surroundings but of the galaxy itself, and of every action that had transpired in his absence. The pulse grew stronger still, expanding outward, brushing the edges of Terra's orbit and the outer reaches of the segmentum solar with imperceptible authority. Fleet captains, psychers, and astropaths felt it in different ways. Nausea, vertigo, psychic resonance, an intuitive understanding of magnitude and inevitability. Reality itself, it seemed, was bending in deference, subtle yet undeniable. Malric's copper eyes glimmered as he sensed the scale of what had begun. This was no awakening in moments or hours. This was an event whose first pulse would echo through centuries. The custodes, now in a subtle shift of formation, had become silent observers of an impossible reality. Malric watched them, wondering if even they fully comprehended what was happening. Their training was unparalleled, yet training could not prepare for a god beginning to awaken. And then, as the pulse reached a crescendo within the throne room, a faint shimmer of movement appeared in the Emperor's form beneath the latticed structure. It was not clear, not defined, yet unmistakable, a hint of a presence flexing, stretching, preparing to reclaim dominion that no mortal could contain. Malric knelt, pressing his forehead to the gilded surface, and felt the pull of inevitability threading through him. The galaxy beyond Terra trembled in response, fleets shifting, populations stirring, alien species sensing change. The Emperor's awakening was no longer theoretical, no longer rumor. It had begun. And as the throne pulsed, as the golden lattice flexed with presence, a single thought suffused Malric's consciousness with icy clarity. The Imperium, as it had been, was ending, and the true scale of what was to come was only just beginning to unfold. The shimmer beneath the throne intensified. Golden filigree seemed to writhe as if alive, reflecting not the hall but something deeper, a presence vast enough to encompass every star, every fleet, every consciousness across the galaxy. Malric felt it in his bones, in the marrow of his hands as they rested upon the gilded edge. A gravity not of mass, but of inevitability. The custodes remained still, their discipline perfect, yet even they could not mask the almost imperceptible tension in their posture. Every instinct, honed over centuries, screamed acknowledgement that a god's awareness had begun to bleed into reality itself. The whispering became an unbroken resonance. It was no longer a phrase, it was a pulse threaded with cognition. I see. I remember. I move. Malric could not distinguish where his thoughts ended and the Emperor's awareness began. The line between observer and observed dissolved, replaced with a crystalline understanding of scale, of consequence. Time itself seemed subordinate, as though seconds and millennia shared the same weight under the pulse of a mind that had slept for 10,000 years. The Golden Throne no longer held a captive. It held a being reasserting dominion, subtle at first, but absolute in intent. Outside the palace, the first waves of response became undeniable. Astropathic networks lit with sudden, erratic communications. Navigators reeled, corridors of the warp twisting unpredictably, forcing entire convoys to halt or reroute. Imperial worlds recorded unprecedented anomalies. Gravitational fluctuations, atmospheric distortions, and, in the most sensitive psychic receivers, an omnipresent awareness pressing against the collective mind. Even alien empires felt it, instinctively adjusting their strategies, sensing an intelligence they could not name but understood as infinitely superior. The pulse spread farther still, reaching systems that had never known the touch of Terra. On a distant Forge world, tech priests recorded impossible readings in energy flux and cogitator outputs, unable to reconcile the calculations with reality. Promethium feed lines hummed with an unnatural resonance, servoskulls hesitated in their motions, and the air carried a subtle metallic tang. Across the void, ships shuddered as though brushed by an invisible hand, warp paths twisting in recognition of a presence beyond comprehension. The galaxy itself seemed to inhale, waiting. Back within the throne room, Malric felt the Emperor's stirrings grow more defined. A flex of muscle-like energy, a pulse of thought, a pull on reality. Each subtle motion carried the weight of eons. The custodes, ever vigilant, remained statuesque, yet Malric perceived the strain in their awareness, the imperceptible alignment of their perception with something immeasurably vast. This was no awakening for mortals to witness. This was an awakening that mortals would experience in echoes, in instinct, in premonition, in the unexplainable stirrings of awe and terror across worlds. And then, for the first time, the Emperor's presence seemed to brush against perception with intention. Malric felt it as a probing, a test, not of loyalty, but of understanding. You have built what I left behind. Do you grasp its weight? The thought did not manifest in words, but in pure, untranslatable cognition, threading itself through his mind, bending him toward comprehension without allowing certainty. The weight of 10,000 years pressed in the pulse of awareness, and the enormity of it made Malric's vision swim with both awe and fear. The galaxy trembled with the first acknowledgement of what was awakening. Systems shifted, populations panicked or worshipped, and fleets altered course instinctively. The pulse spread without mercy, touching all, sparing none. And yet it was not wrath, it was presence, assertion, inevitability. It did not demand, it simply was, and all things, loyal, heretic, mortal, machine, and alien, recognized it with instinctive clarity. Malric pressed his forehead once more to the gilded surface of the throne, and a single inescapable truth filled his consciousness. The Imperium, for all its faith and order, was no longer the master of its fate. The Emperor's awakening would not arrive with ceremony or clarity. It would arrive as presence, as force, as inevitability, and its first ripples had already begun across the stars. The eyes that had slept for 10 millennia were opening, and the galaxy, vast, complex, and fragile, had no choice but to tremble in response. The Golden Throne pulsed once more, subtly, imperceptibly, yet irrevocably. And with that single movement, the first chapter of a new age began.